The Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Read by Ghosty Keys. After all, there was nothing sensational. Sensational. Wow, good start. All right, let's take that again. After all, there was nothing sensational about Mr. Ladley's return. He came at 8 o'clock that night, fresh shaved and with his hair cut, and although he had a latchkey, he rang the doorbell. I knew the ring. And I thought it no harm to carry an old razor of Mr. Pittman's with me, with the blade open and folded back on the handle, just in case. But I saw at once he meant no mischief. "Good evening," he said, and he put out his hand, and I jumped back till I saw there was nothing in it, and he only meant to shake hands. But I didn't do it. I might have to take him in and make his bed and cook his meals, but I did not have to shake hands with him. "You too," he said, looking at me with what I suppose he meant to be a reproachful look. But he could no more put an expression of that sort in his eyes than a fish could. "I suppose then there's no use asking if I may have my old room. The front room, I won't need two." Well, I didn't want him, and it must have been seen. But I took him in. "You may have it as far as I'm concerned. But you have to let the paper hanger in tomorrow." Assuredly." He came into the hall and stood looking around him, and I fancied he drew a breath of relief. "It isn't much yet," he said, "but it's better to look at than 6 feet of muddy water." "Or stone walls," I said. He looked at me and smiled. "Yes, or stone walls." And so I had him in again. And if I gave him only the dull knives and locked up the bread knife the moment I finished with it, who can blame me? I took all the precautions I could. I had a friend put an extra bolt on every door, and I hid the rat poison. Peter would not go near him. He hobbled around on his 3 legs, with a splint beating a sort of tattoo on the floor, but he stayed back in the kitchen with me, or in the yard. It was Sunday night or early Monday morning that Jennie Brice disappeared. On Thursday evening, her husband came back. And then on Friday, the body of a woman washed ashore at Beaver. But it turned out to be that of a stewardess who had fallen overboard from one of the Cincinnati packets. Mr. Ladley himself showed me the article in the morning paper when I took breakfast. You know, public hysteria has killed a man before for this. Suppose that woman had been mangled, or the screw of the steamer had cut off her head. How many people do you suppose would have been willing to swear it was Mrs. Ladley? "Even without a head, I'd know Mrs. Ladley," I retorted. He shrugged his shoulders. "Let's trust she's still alive, for my sake. But I'm glad anyhow that this woman has a head. You'll allow me to be glad, won't you? You can be anything you want as far as I'm concerned." I snapped and went out. Well, Mr. Holcomb still retained the second-story front room. I think, although he said nothing more about it, that he was still playing horse. He wrote a good bit at the washstand, and from the loose sheets of manuscript he left, I believe he actually tried to write a play. but mostly he wandered along the waterfront, or stood on one another of the bridges looking at the water, thinking. It's certain that he tried to keep in the part. He smoked cigarettes, but he hated them. He usually ended up throwing a cigarette away and then lighting his old pipe. On that Thursday evening, he came home and sat down to supper with Mr. Reynolds. He ate little and seemed much excited. The talk ran on crime, as it always did when he was around. Mr. Holcomb quoted Spencer a great deal, Herbert Spencer. Mr. Reynolds was impressed, not knowing much beyond skills in the National League. Spencer, Holcomb would say, Spencer shows that every occurrence is the inevitable result of what has gone before, and carries in its train an equally inevitable series of results. Try to interrupt this chain to the smallest degree, and what follows? Chaos, my dear. Chaos. Well, we see that at the store, Mr. Reynolds would say. Accustom a lot of women to a silk sale on Fridays, and then make it toothbrushes. That'll bring you chaos, all right. Well, Mr. Holcomb came back that night around 10 o'clock, and I told him Ladley was back. He was almost wild with excitement and wanted to have the back parlor so he could watch him through the keyhole, and he was terribly upset when I told him there was no keyhole. The door was fastened with a sunbolt. But on learning that the room was to be papered the next morning, he grew calmer. But he got the paper hanger's address for me, and he went out just after that. Friday, as I say, was very quiet. Mr. Ladley moved to the back parlor and lit the paper hanger in the front room, and then he smoked and fussed with his papers all day. Mr. Holcomb just stayed in his room, which was unusual. In the afternoon, Molly McGuire put on the striped fur. In the afternoon, Molly McGuire put on In the afternoon, Molly McGuire put on the striped fur coat and went out, going slowly past the house so that I was sure to see her. Beyond banging the window down, I gave her no satisfaction. At 4 o'clock, Mr. Holcomb came to my kitchen, rubbing his hands together. He had a pasterboard tube in his hand about a foot long with an arrangement of small mirrors on it. He said it was modeled after something or other that was used on a submarine, and he used a paper hanger and had it fixed in place on the floor between his room and the ceiling of Mr. Ladley's room so that the chandelier would hide it from below. He was hoping that he could watch Mr. Ladley through it. And as it turned out, he could. I want to find a weak moment, he said. I want to know what he does when the door is closed and make him take off his mask. I want to know if he sleeps with a light. If he does, I replied. I hope you'll let me know, Mr. Holcomb. The gas bills are a horror as it is. I think he kept it on all last night. I turned off all the other lights and went to the cellar. The meter was still going round and round. That's fine. Every murderer fears the dark, and our friend of the parlor room is a murderer, Mrs. Pittman. Whether he hangs or not, he's our murderer. The mirror affair, after which Mr. Holcomb called a periscope, was put in that day and worked amazingly well. I went with him to try it out, and I distinctly saw the paper hanger take a cigarette from Mr. Ladley's case and put it in his pocket. Just after that, Mr. Ladley sauntered into the room and looked at the new paper. I could both see him and hear him. It was rather weird. God, he said, what a wallpaper! Well, you must admit, wallpapers of the 1910s were just hysterical. They were awesome. I would have them now if we could. They were terrific and completely horrible at the same time. Well, that's it. That's chapter 6. 7.